going to record this, and there will be some post emails and so on. But I think out of respect for everybody's time, I'm going to kick off and welcome you all with a degree of warmth, hopefully. Feel free to be on camera or not, as you feel led. The idea behind this is that we're going to have a conversation about the business case and to really set the scene between the need for, or the link between developing leadership and business impact. Now, before we get into that, I just want to clarify what we mean by leadership, because in my work with clients, I have seen over and over again that when people talk about leadership, they think executives. They think that leadership is executive, and so executive development. And I want to, in our world, we differentiate between the role that somebody occupies and their behavior. So in our world, we talk about you occupy the role of a manager, you choose to behave like a leader. You occupy the role of an executive or a business unit leader or a managing director. You occupy that role. How you behave will differentiate whether you are a leader or not. And as we talk about leadership development in general, we're talking about learning the skills and behaving in a way that is inspiring others to follow. So it's about influence. It's about creating a climate around you through how you behave. It is not about filling in leave forms or doing strategic planning. Those are functional elements which are important, and it's not to devalue their importance, but it is to differentiate between the interpersonal human skills that are required to lead an organization versus the functional elements of managing an organization. I think that one of the reasons why there is a confusion here is it causes a bit of a challenge because people don't understand what we mean by leadership development. So that's what we're here to discuss, is how can we change our language or introduce new language into our context that we're in and help bring the priority of developing leadership skills into the business, not because it's nice to do, but because it's essential and critical for an organization. Now, to join me, so my name is Angela. If those of you who don't know me, my name is Angela de Longchamps, and I'll chair this conversation and possibly add some of my own thoughts, but I really want to hear from our panel and our guests. So in the text chat at the moment, I'm going to post in immediately. So that's my LinkedIn. If you want to join and connect with me over LinkedIn, I do try and add value to my LinkedIn community, particularly on the subject of leadership development. So you might gather some interesting thoughts, challenges, personal development. But joining me today is Tendai Chitapi. So Tendai's bio, when we focused on the webinar, is a little misleading. So I'm putting his link in the text chat here, but he's got wide and diverse experience, particularly emphasizing the financial side of a business. So on top of his accounting studies and his MBA, he's actually done a lot in the finance function before broadening his skill set and moving into the entrepreneurial world in agri-tech and a startup and more on the strategy side of a business, but really looking at the financial well-being of businesses and how to be more strategic in managing your finances. And I particularly wanted him to wear that hat. He has also evolved as in his career and has moved into the world of leadership development. But in the context here, I want him to dig into his foundations in business finance and that side of the business. And then to complement him, we have Nina. So Nina Sternberg and I have actually known each other for many years, but Nina is the on-the-ground HR practitioner who has lots of very real experience. She's been a big company employee and then moved into the HR leadership role in smaller organizations. And why I invited her is because she's not just once, but successfully multiple times influenced her organization to implement leadership development. And I'm like, wow, that's pretty special. So come and tell your story. How did you make that happen? How did you get that done? So Nina, I mean, as I said, I've worked with her for, well, not with her, but in the same environment for some time. And I noticed a change in our conversation when she finished her executive development program. So just the way that she's always been very concrete in her thinking and very strategic, but just moving into that exec ed, hanging out with some different thinkers has helped her, I think, shape a very strategic view of HR in the business. So I hope that you'll enjoy the company as much as I have in the pre-calls. I wanted to also just start with a little bit of a quiz, and no, it's not a quiz, it's a poll. Let's not be honest. So you should have a poll coming up on your screen at the moment. So to tell us a little bit about who you are, so we know who's in the room. The first question, you can actually choose multiple, because many of us are wearing multiple hats. Okay, so Nina Tendai, you just so that you know, we have got a broad spread. 50% are people employed in an organization. I would imagine that 40% of those or thereabout are senior leadership. 47% are in HR, 20% are managers, 40% are business owners. And then we've got a couple of people who are something else, which would be fascinating to know what else is out there that isn't there. But it's a good spread across the mix. Okay, I'll leave that up there for anybody who hasn't cyclists. I do also want to encourage you, post any questions that you have into the text chat. You're very welcome to participate in the discussion, ask your own questions as we go. So just to get the context here, why leadership matters, I'd like to know, just maybe Tendai, you can let us know, the financial and operational perspective, where you wear that hat, what are the tangible costs that you've seen in organizations where leadership development isn't prioritized or isn't done effectively? How does it impact the bottom line that you've seen?
Morning, Angela, and good morning to Nina, my fellow panelist, and to all the guests in the room. Thank you for that, for setting the scene as you have. So when you frame leadership development as behavior rather than role, I think it's quite clear that there is an imperative upon every individual in an organization to behave in the best interest of the financial health of the organization. So we can go from a waste conscious view of managing kitchen supplies, just to take a very practical example, right? Which is a lesser risk, component of the business, to the emotional profile and version of self that shows up in a room to negotiate a contract, or to with either a customer or a vendor. I mean, you asked specifically about cost, but I think it works on both sides of the P&L, right? What are the financial implications of the presence or absence of a leadership, let's call it a mindset, which is something that can be learned if it is not inherent, right? And I think this is part of what we're trying to drive home today, that, the showing upness of people in your organization is going to be, so Angela makes up words for those that don't know. One of her key values in leadership development is stick-to-itiveness, in terms of how, people can stick to their mindset and behavior changes in the leadership development world. So I'm going to co-opt showing upness.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think there's a fundamental a reality that we have experienced, that leadership development is one of the important ways in which people can feel like they are being empowered in a business.
Mm.
When you empower people in a business, they show up with more intent and with, I think, a deeper level of commitment. In leadership development as a retention driver, for example, if we want to talk specifically about strategic cost implications. I recently spoke to someone who was in management in an organization where leadership development has not been given priority. And as a result, there is a culture, a pretty high turnover in terms of staff. And so she was saying, I can never get to the business of managing my role because I'm always having to train new people. And so that training becomes a cost. When you develop leaders over time, you gain efficiencies, you gain innovation. They get creative ways to actually save the business money or make the business money. And that institutional memory is one of the long-term ROIs that you gain when you invest in helping your people to think differently in their in their day-to-day work. I think your framing again of role versus mindset is key, because it gives everybody the responsibility to think as a leader in the business, and not only the onus of thinking in the commercial interest of the business is not only on those in hierarchical leadership. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, I've said, the training costs, the reduced attrition, I think increased wellness. So again, sense of belonging. These are all factors which, when you look holistically, drive a person and a worker's approach to their decision making, which is ultimately how bottom lines are either affected for better or for worse.
I'm hearing you talk about the training people and the attrition. So attrition has lots of hidden costs which people don't always think about. They think about maybe recruitment costs, but they forget about the amount of time the new person takes to be trained, how much time that takes from the upline, the fact that that person is their manager, for example, is doing all this training and isn't doing the next thing that they should be doing. And that leads to longer working days, resentment, lower personal levels of engagement, and then the lower well-being. And now we see this whole well-being space popping up. Nina, you've been working in the businesses and sensing when things go wrong. And I think that was something we spoke about earlier, is from your perspective, what do you see? What have the signals been in the organizations that you've worked at that you went, no, hang on, there's a need here for stronger leadership? And how did that impact the organization?
Thanks, Angela. So when we look at leadership really, the role of the manager has an impact on every facet of the business, really starting from a strategic level. So when you look at a business strategy, that strategy is only as effective as the people responsible for implementing that strategy. Looking at the next touch point around the impact of leadership on culture. So culture is not, sometimes we struggle to define culture, and often you walk through a building and you'll want to see values on a wall that will talk to culture, but culture is really shaped by leaders' behaviors. So it really sets the tone for, what is valued, what is rewarded in a business, and what is effectively tolerated. To think of another example, we can look at engagement. So what is the leader's role on engagement and keeping people engaged? And engagement in itself is quite a broad topic, but if we look at a specific variable of management engagement, it is really, what is that manager doing to coach, to guide, to communicate within a team? So a whole lot of different touch points. And I think if we look at a very practical example that I've seen in different businesses, is managers struggling with the basic conversation of giving feedback of having a tough discussion and actually how to navigate those more difficult types of conversations. And often we find, I'm not sure if it's a cultural norm in South Africa, but people like to tiptoe around the issues instead of being able to engage directly and having a constructive real-time feedback discussion. So I would say those are, that's really we see the impact of the manager from a strategic level to giving feedback on a daily basis.
So what do you see as your role then as HR in dealing with those kind of problems?
So really as my role as HR, and I think anybody that has got a responsibility, let's say in the business, even if there isn't an HR department, is to really share the impact and what is the role of the leader. So the role of the leader is broad. So I'm just going to touch on, let's say, a few key examples that are relevant to today's discussion. So one of those could be, the role of the leader is to drive performance and productivity in the business. And when we look at that role, what it actually means is, how does the manager manage expectations? How do they hold people accountable? How do they recognize performance in a business? And managers that know how to do that properly can really unlock the full potential of an employee. And to Tendai's point, that really has a direct impact on the bottom line of the business. Secondly, we can look at the role of the leader, which is around building engagement and retention in a business. Again, directly impacts your bottom line. But research actually suggests that when we look at why people leave businesses, people don't leave businesses. They actually leave managers. And research further goes on to tell us from a recent study that was actually done within a South African context, is that the leading indicator for engagement is the relationship you have with your line manager. So by investing in leadership development, you're actually investing in the overall employee experience, which ultimately leads to higher retention, again, impacting the bottom line of the business. And also another point that Tendai mentioned was, people leaving. What is the cost of that to the business? And by investing in leadership development, you're investing in succession. You're investing in future capability in the business, which ultimately leads to sustainable growth. That you're not going through all of these. You're not having to manage each of these costs, but rather how can you more retain people, build people, and invest money differently, and you're not seeing that churn happen in the business.
Yeah. I mean, the link between engagement and business results is something that I'm not sure how broadly understood it is. It's something that I feel very passionate about and have been beating this drum for a while. But I found a quick presentation. It's engaged employees. The impact of an engaged employee is on these hardcore measures: productivity, turnover, profitability, NPS. And this is better up Glassdoor, Gallup research. So there's loads of research that backs this up, that the golden chalice for business performance is not measuring results more. It's not beating up clients more. It's around creating an environment in which employees can be engaged. It's also one of those things that you don't get to beat people into engagement. It's around creating the environment that fosters engagement. And when we start thinking about ourselves in the business as farmers or gardeners, it's around creating the climate that a particular plant will thrive. You can't force the plant to thrive. It's the climate, it's the soil conditions, it's the sun, it's the rain. Those are climate conditions that we can create inside an organization in which people can be engaged. And I think you already alluded to this, but probably the most impactful piece of research that was ever done, and has been proved and proved and proved again, is that 70% of the variance in engagement is determined by the manager. And that's that kind of hardcore number that says if we help our managers behave in a way that fosters engagement, creates the climate that fosters engagement, it will lead to bottom line impact, results, turnover, and so on. I see you both, nodding your head, and I'm wondering also in the group out there if there are more thoughts or questions that are coming up that might be there for you. But the real link between employee engagement and business results, or let's work it backwards. Business results can be impacted by engaged employees. Engaged employees are impacted by leaders and managers who behave in a way that fosters employee engagement. And we, in the organization side of the organization, enablers, executive, HR, finance, we are responsible for equipping managers with the skills to garden, to farm, with some level of awareness and intention. So some interesting, hopefully that's the link that we can see going through that. So Nina, from a business point of view, you've spoken about the impact and what you've seen and managers who aren't able to hold difficult conversations, which honestly is almost the beginning point. If you're in an organization and you're seeing the people around you can't have difficult conversations, struggle to give difficult feedback, aren't behaving in a way that aligns with the organizational values, these are triggers, it's data points that help you go, I can help. If we get leadership development happening in this organization, we can start to solution some of these problems. How did you message that? How did you get from, I see the problems, how did you get to positioning a solution?
Yeah, so I think, Angela, quite practically, a difficult discussion for HR comes down to budget, going in for that fight to say, how do I get budget? And when we go through budgeting cycles, it's often chaos. Everything is urgent, and people are putting through proposals where you see it's critical, it's strategic, it's been CEO approved, and now you've got HR that says, hold on, I need budget for a leadership development program. So quite practically, the way that I've positioned that in the business is really through the cell of we're dealing with people. We're dealing with people every single day. As much as businesses are moving towards tech and AI and ChatGPT already becoming our language, we're in the business of dealing with people. And when I've been very fortunate to understand the crafting of the Inspired Leadership program, and so I think looking at it from the perspective of actually going through the program, it becomes an easier discussion to pitch to the business. But it effectively starts off with leading self. And again, how do we expect leaders to lead other people if they're not aware of themselves and such, basic concepts such as self-awareness? So on a very practical level, understanding yourself is vital to be able to lead others. And then moving into the broader context of the business is, leading the business. And what is the role of the manager in managing themes such as performance, as well as leading change? And then from there, building onto the next theme of, leading others, and then really leading change in a business and a culture of well-being. So I think if you can actually understand how all these different themes fit together, they are absolutely vital when you explain the role of a manager and how impactful and practical and how real life each of these different modules are that make a difference. And again, something that's actually also just stood out for me is, there's so many different leadership courses on the market. And what we find is we have these 1 or 2 day courses that individuals can go on. And when you're there in the meeting room or online, you're taking notes and you're trying to understand how you can actually implement this in the workplace. But what is so practical about this course is what you're learning about is real life, and it becomes easy to implement, not only through the theory, but through the way in which the course is actually run. And for me, that really stands out, where you are not, again, let's say to your ministers of finance, there's a tangible return on investment that you're actually seeing from investing in the course. It's not just a paper pencil exercise where managers are going to get leadership training through a 1 or 2 day program, but it's actually sustainable the way that the training is done through the different parts, through the different themes, that it gives managers a holistic understanding to truly show up in the workplace.
So when you advocate for that to actually do something inside your organizations, what did you do? Like, how did you get them to go yes? Because that was internal advocacy. I mean, you had an idea of what you wanted to do, but then what?
So I think speaking to this, to really speak to this from a very practical level, I think it definitely helps to build partners and sponsors in the business. From an HR perspective, HR shouldn't go into these discussions, let's say, alone. And often we see the importance of these discussions, but the rest of the business don't. And very important, I think, firsthand to get that support and to get that, let's say, executive sponsorship before you go in and have these discussions where people see the bigger picture and understand the bigger picture thinking of why these types of, why this type of course specifically is so important. And if, for example, if you need to get your CFO on board, because that's really where the funding is going to come from, some practical tips is just to align on the why, understand why this is so important. And secondly, speak the same language, speak each other's language. So from an HR perspective, speak around retention and productivity and, absenteeism, and let your person in finance help you translate that into the ROI. So you can take it as a measurable, something that's absolutely measurable to the business. And when you go to the business, go as a unified force. Show the business imperative together and how this can truly have an impact on the bottom line.
So I'm hearing a bit of this strategic play here. This isn't just just going in. You're building it around a conversation. You're building it around an awareness drive, especially if you're in an organization with low awareness of the importance of leadership development. You actually need to do some education. There's to make some alliances within the decision makers, within the stakeholders, so that you're not asking for something that's coming out of left field. And if there is limited or no budget, you have to lay the groundwork over time. Tendai, you've been on the receiving end, I'm sure, of these kind of conversations. What is your guidance, being the Minister of Finance, and having had to look at it from that angle?
Yeah, thanks. I think, I want to build on your analogy of farming, right? One of the things that I've learned in that part of my career journey, working with farmers, and sort of building digital and AI-driven solutions in that world. When we spoke to a lot of the technical people who have been part of the learning and understanding in that space, it's this idea that in this day and age, we don't farm the crop, we farm the soil, right? Because as you've alluded, when you farm the soil, the crop behaves as, in a way that is almost automatic and intuitive to the climate, what you call the climate and the conditions in which it has been, sown, right? And good soil will invariably lead to a healthy and flourishing crop. So with that understanding, we throw around words like organizational culture, and we give them this very flimsy and fuzzy reference and classification in our approach to it, as though it is something which is a nice to have. Leadership development is the same as creating very healthy and fertile soil for the plants in which which represent your people are then thriving and flourishing. And I think the very important business understanding is that, when you look at a P&L or a balance sheet, what you are actually looking at, as Nina has alluded to, is a reflection of interactions between human beings, right, that have resulted in a series of decisions and agreements which have built up what is the financial performance of the business, right? But behind those numbers are people, and I think to ensure that those people are well equipped to continuously deliver a healthy and an upward financial and commercial trajectory is important. I think we might all have seen a version of this story between a CEO and a CFO, where I think the CEO comes to the CFO and says, or I think the CFO asks, I think in this instance, he's one of the sort of bean counters, and says, what if we train people and then they leave? To which the leader replies, what if we don't and then they stay? Right? And I think that is the lens through which you have to approach the reality of keeping your people thoughtful, keeping them engaged, and how leadership development becomes, I think the most essential human-centered lever that you can pull in an organization to drive business growth. I think that is my learning over time. There are many parts of business that we have to make strategic decisions around, but when it comes to people, I think leadership development is the one lever you can pull, which has, again, as you've shown in that Gallup result, Paul, has the most significant, and I think the most almost immediate financial ROI, which is sustained over time. I want to also point out, again, an analogy that you always we talk about when we have our conversations is around fitness. You don't go to the gym over one weekend, lift weights, and then you are now fit and buff, and that's the end of the story. You stay fit, right? You allude to this idea that fitness and muscle development over time and your overall, the health and fitness is a use it or lose it reality, right? If you go to the gym and you train, you build the muscle, you have to keep on using the muscle to keep the muscle. And if you don't use it, it will over time, it weakens and breaks down, right? And leadership development can be seen as a muscle, is building muscle into your business, into your bench. I shared something recently on LinkedIn that soldiers don't train in the middle of the war, right? When the war comes, it's time to fight. And leadership development is, for me, that piece where you are constantly giving that an almost a systematic and militarily regimented approach to keeping your staff, your people, battle ready at any given moment. And so, yeah, I think the cost drivers and even the revenue drivers, I mean, things like emotional intelligence, conflict resolution, communication skills. These are skills that fundamentally impact whether or not deals get closed in some cases, right? Conflict resolution. If you and your client reach a deadlock and you have a toolkit that allows you to say, okay, let me meet him where he is. Just that understanding that, okay, let me get outside of myself and let me try and have some empathy. Let me see where he's coming from. Let me see where these thought processes, right, that can happen in real time and that are not naturally intuitive to many of us, and particularly to people that are technical, right? Technical people are very sort of driven by the technical constructs of their particular roles, and so how to manage and facilitate the human interactions is not something which is a skill set that they, fundamentally have inherently. The beauty of leadership is that it is something that, like any mindset shift, that can be taught. Right? But the organization has to avail that particular training and those resources to their workforce. And I think the other, fallacy is that you either have to have a multinational, multi-million rand development and training program or nothing, and that those are the options. That's not the reality, because the argument that often comes, because I think part of what we're doing here is to, let's be practical, right? A lot of people here are here to understand, how do we speak the language of business and commercial and even the financial language that will help us to get the green light and to get this advocacy over the line internally. And I think where there is resistance, the idea is we don't have to, boil the ocean, as it were, right? We can try and understand fundamentally where our most critical needs are, and then gradually build in a leadership development strategy over time. And it has to be a strategy. It cannot be a one and done. It cannot be a line item that is there just because, right? When we take this view that we're, I think, trying to frame, that it has this trickle-down effect into what the numbers look like at the end of the financial year, it has to be leadership development as a strategy and not leadership development as an occasional or optional endeavor.
As a transaction or an intervention. We don't do leadership development as an intervention. Here's a 2-day thing. We tick the box and we're done. We're done. I like to use a lot of lessons from personal experience, which, Dion, you'll be happy to know, are from cycling. And I mean, I am a road rider by nature. Riding on the road on a bicycle is I want to say easy. It's a lot of work because you have to go up a lot of hills, and I mean, honestly, that takes a bit of effort. It's not all downhill, but it's easier for me to be a road cyclist. At the end of middle of last year, decided I was going to do this big event that is a mountain bike event. And it would seem to be the same thing because it's also 2 wheels and you kind of go forward and there's hills involved. But turns out it's like a completely different skill. And there was lots of falling involved and related injuries. And I did a lot of intentional learning, watching YouTube videos. I found a guy who told me how to do certain things on YouTube. So I YouTubed it, and I joined a group, and they were giving me like coaching on the side, do this and do that, and lean this way, and loosen up your handlebars, lean back in the sand, and all sorts of things, technical ways to manage in the moment that made me, I had to be very conscious to avoid the falling, but I had to be very conscious of using the skills as I was learning them. And then when I did this big event, I wasn't quite as conscious. I kind of relaxed a little bit, and I actually, at least at this point, I enjoyed the event. I didn't die, so that's a good thing. I enjoyed it. It was a good event. And then I got off my mountain bike and went, well, look at that. I'm done. Kind of done. Summer, road riding, happy it's Larry, got on my mountain bike about 6 months later. And it was almost like I had to relearn it. I had to be thinking very consciously, what did they say again about knees and looking through corners and sand? And I had to remember very consciously what I'd learned before. And it was natural at the time, like it got to a point of being sort of natural at the time of the event, but 6 months was nothing. And I had to go almost from scratch. Not quite, but because I had a base, but it was almost from scratch. And as I'm riding along here, I kept thinking, that's what doing leadership development is like if you do a short intervention. You do a short intervention, you grow the skill, you're very conscious, maybe even intentional, and then you're done. And unless you're using it on a very regular basis, the skill and the awareness drops. You go back to your normal way of doing things until you very intentionally are in that spot where you have to navigate through a complexity or lead through change or whatever it is. And either you have it or you don't to kind of rest on. It was very enlightening to me to go through that. Cycling teaches me all sorts of things, humility being one of them, constant humility. But it is a useful thing to think when we're looking at behavior change, and leadership development particularly is a behavior change. This is not about learning a functional skill. Once you've learned how to use ChatGPT, then you can say, I've figured it out, or I've learned how to souffle in the kitchen. I've figured it out. Behavior is something that you have to consciously and be constantly reminded about over time to build neural pathways that become thicker and thicker with use to create new habits. Otherwise, we just go right back to the way we were. We're quick to do that. So intervention-based learning creates a peak and then a trough, and then a peak and then a trough. So we actually need to look at sustained interventions over time, not even interventions. That's why we do journeys, but it's sustained over time so that you keep on mountain biking regularly, so that you can become much more confident in an unfamiliar setting, which you're not naturally good at, but you're doing it over time. So a long time later, you're like, oh, totally I can totally mountain bike. Give me the next horrible obstacle. I'm in. Dion, you and I, we're like in sync here. I'm like, I'm sure there's going to be a thought or a question or a comment. Have at it.
So I wasn't going to chip in with a cycling analogy, even though I was tempted. But where does EQ fit in here? Because I think the danger of not doing leadership development is we kind of hope we've hired good leaders, and that's going to be based on what their default natural style is. And sometimes EQ, or the lack of EQ, comes into play when you talk about that moment in time leadership intervention. With the right amount of EQ, you can have leaders who perhaps can reflect on, whoops, I'm sliding back to my old styles, or perhaps I'm forgetting some of the basics, towards more, of a, I have no EQ and I don't think I need to change, so I'm just a leadership style that I was born with, or whatever. And Lord knows we don't have to look far around the world today to see the consequences of those kind of leaders. They're all around us, right? Mm-hmm. No names mentioned.
No, none. We'll just draw our own conclusions. Okay, so where does EQ fit in? Tendai, Nina, either of you want to chip in and have a go?
Yeah, I'll come in. I'll come in first there. I think one of the important insights that I've sort of learned this year is, someone said something to the effect that, when you hire someone, it's a bit of guesswork. It's only when you promote them or fire them that you have come to learn the reality of the correctness of your choice. That's when you know. So when at the beginning you're guessing, when you promote or fire, then now you've learned what you could not have possibly known. I think I also want to borrow something that I learned, I think, from, is it Mark Rudolph? I think he's one of the co-founders of Netflix. He says their policy documents internally are such that they don't have, volumes and volumes of this, and then, get this number of approvals for you to go and purchase a pen for you or whatever. It's like, it's very, they defer to the maturity of their people, right? And so they have got unlimited leave days. They don't have very, very rigid guidelines on how you should be. But invariably, there's going to be one or two that spoil it for everybody. And the question was, in that instance, what do you do when we've given people the maturity and the respect of being mature in making their decisions and just getting their work done, but then a few of them take advantage, right, of that flexibility? What do you do? And so one of his, answers was, you get rid of those troublemakers. You get rid, because they are the minority. And we don't want to create a culture where the minority ends up being allowed to remain and maintain, I think, what ultimately is a toxic environment. But the point that I'm trying to drive here is that in that instance, leadership development offers an opportunity for behavior change, right? Emotional intelligence, I think, is a fundamental part of what is not ordinarily a learned reality and how we interact with people. You alluded, Dion, in your question that I am just rigid. That's just how I am, right? And I think you have to, at a point, provide an opportunity for change, because emotional intelligence, like any other behavior, and the neural pathway rewiring that Angela has alluded to. I mean, we're getting into the realm of neuroscience, right? When we're talking about changed behavior, understanding the emotions of others, understanding what facial expressions mean, understanding, people's moods, understanding who has walked into your room without them having said anything, right? How you are going to show up to the individual that has walked into your room. One example that I've learned about this, I think it was a testimonial from one of the leadership journeys, was saying, I realized that I was a bad listener, and that people were coming to me with very good ideas, insights, trying to make me aware of situations in the business. And I was quick to try and solve the problem. I was not listening with empathy. I was not listening to understand, right? And he says, the moment that I understood that, take a moment, that half a second when your limbic system, that limbic hijacking, when that fight or flight, that half a second, just breathe beyond it, and then be present to the engagement of your colleague. And he said, it has changed how I interact with people, right? And that's something he learned. That's an EQ journey, right? That's an EQ component. I mean, there's so many different components to EQ. I'm just giving one example, right? And he says, I also realized that I've got very intelligent colleagues. Right? Because now I was just listening with fresh ears that were not, where their message was not being processed through all of my filters, all of my biases, all of my issues, all of my ego, right? And so that is that I'm giving you a practical, I think, sort of exemplar of where EQ then fits in. So now you don't necessarily just have to fire people, right? As a response to where in deficit, you can actually, I think, coach and bring them into a space where, oh, okay, hopefully, if we keep this EQ muscle trained, we have just helped someone to just be a better human.
I think to add to that, Dion, you alluded to the fact that the person doesn't want to change. And I think that should be a red flag, because a growth mindset, knowing maybe they've had feedback that their conduct, their behavior, their outcomes, whatever is not acceptable. And if they go, well, I don't care, then you do want to fire their ass, to use the language of, my previous team members, which are very funny. But if you get the feedback through and they go, oh, how can I change? Aha, the world is your oyster. If there's a willingness to learn and grow, do not fire them. Do not do anything. Foster that and help them. And one of the things that we very heavily work with is voluntary participation. We only work with people who want to learn, because otherwise we're just wasting a lot of time on sending people to coaching. Never gonna happen, people. You don't send people to coaching. They choose to take coaching on board. You send people to prison where there's no choice. But people need to want to learn and grow. If we don't want to, we can't. I saw a statistic a while ago that 75% of leadership is learned behavior, or learnable behavior. And I want to take that back to my example of the riding, is that I ride with some mountain bikers who honestly are amazing. They are so skilled. They look like they were born on a bicycle, a mountain bike, and they're leaping off things. I mean, you've seen some of these people on YouTube. And then you trace it back and you go, they were on BMXs when they were 3, and then they were doing off-road something with motocross when they were 4.5. They grew up in that circumstance. So mountain biking is just part of who they are. So some people are leaders because that's how they grew up. They have emotional intelligence because of their background, their exposure, their experience, their hardships, their family of origin, whatever, all sorts of things they're naturally good at. They got that as part of their gene pool. Not even gene, but culture and society and nurture. And then there are others who didn't. learned to mountain bike when they were immediately born, that rode bicycles to school on the road, because that's what you do. You ride bicycles on the road. And now to learn mountain biking requires significant effort, a willingness to do it, and persistence and endurance, because I think it's worth it. I think it's worth it. So when we're looking at leadership development, you're looking at your raw material and going, do the people in my organization, do they see that it's worth it to do the hard things that this requires? Because listening is a hard thing. If it was easy, we'd all be doing it. Demonstrating self-restraint, self-control, it's a hard thing. It requires intentional effort. If it was easy, we'd all be doing it. So leadership behaviors, by definition, are actually quite difficult for most of us, which requires us to then be intentional about it and have a willingness to grow it. I'll land the plane on that particular thought. So I'm conscious that we have just a couple of minutes left. Nina, I'm going to ask you to just your thoughts, your kind of closing thoughts on, again, your practical experience. What has made this overcoming resistance, getting buy-in, putting the business case together? What are the final things that you think have been important for your journey?
I think just to reflect, and often when we're looking more from a smaller business type lens, is I would encourage businesses to start small. Even if you don't have, let's say you're not at a stage where you're ready to roll out a full, leadership training program, start with small daily habits that can inspire the thinking and start to inspire the change in the business. So if you have to just, some real practical tips, look for inspired leaders, up and coming leaders in a business that really, that stand out. And they can even start to become, let's say, your change agents, who would be earmarked for potentially future leadership roles in a business. Focus on mentorship discussions, focus on stretch assignments, because these are really practical, on-the-job type practices that all businesses can implement, that really invest in talent and building a talent pipeline. Encourage managers to give feedback. People want feedback, and feedback is how we learn and grow. And encourage a culture of feedback. And for me, what really stands out is reflection. We don't do enough reflecting. So make reflection intentional in what we do, and encourage, again, that is a behavior within your teams and within your businesses, if you can influence that. Because all of these practices really start to build a baseline for something that you can grow on when you in a space where you can now go and execute on a program that really speaks to the bigger picture.
So starting small and taking an approach when you don't have much bandwidth or maybe influence, maybe you're new in an organization, you start looking for small, often free, and often, this is what I certainly found, is a DIY approach. You have to be able to do it yourself. There isn't buy-in yet to do more. So what can you do in tiny little workshop, or sending out some flyers that you as HR can start to get the language out there whilst you're influencing your colleagues around the business case? Because it's a both and don't see it as an either or. Often I think small businesses go, well, we don't have budget, which means we never will have budget, therefore we can't do anything. And that's a cop-out, because you're not helping the business to actually get to the point where they can see the value, they can see the link between learning leadership behaviors and business results. That's there. And you actually, Nina, you've got a very interesting story. You were telling us in the pre-call, summarize it, but hope you can make it true, is the impact that you've seen of broader, it's not just leadership development, you've been looking at culture and with an outcome around employee engagement and business. Do you want to just share the good story that you've been able to sing?
Yeah, I mean, I can. It's linked to a bigger theme around employee engagement, which has been a very big focus area for us as a business. And engagement is one of the metrics on our business scorecard. So we've got our financial as well as our non-financial metrics. And engagement is something I'm proud to see up there, but it shows that it's something that the business truly values. And what we have seen over, let's say specifically our last financial year, which ended 31 March, we had a difficult target. I don't want to say impossible, because in our business, nothing is impossible, but it can become challenging. And when we looked at this target, we were like, how are we actually going to do this? And we looked at multiple different practices on how we're going to achieve this engagement target. And through, let's say, a very intentional strategy, a very guided strategy, very focused and very deliberate, we were actually able to achieve this target. And, you know, we managers were a key part of this, and we had change champions that we had appointed in the business to help us really carry the people along and support the attainment of this goal. But we've seen a phenomenal impact. I mean, we've obviously got managers on different types of courses in the business. Leadership development being a key pillar for us as part of our overall employee engagement experience and engagement strategy. But we achieved our results, and it's not my result or an HR result, but it's a team result, and it's a result of everybody pulling together intentionally in the right direction. And anything is possible, and that's the way we define our vision in our business.
Thank you. So thank you, Nina, for sharing. And it's a good news story.
I hope that answers your question, because
it does.
a bit more to engagement than specifically around leadership, but all the pieces of the puzzle, they're actually all linked together.
They are all, and I think that's the key thing. If you're aiming at engagement, you can look at it from different angles. Leadership development is one of the pillars. It's not the only pillar, but it is one of the pillars that has a big influence on engagement, which is one of the big influences on business results. That's the flow of the business case. That's how you get buy-in, is if you can link it to business results and make that journey come through. So what we're going to share with you after this is some resources to help you, some numbers and data in a little pack, so that you can take that and socialize it with the stakeholders in your business to raise the conversation, to raise the awareness around the link between the business impact and how people behave. And that leadership development is about helping people learn the behaviors that can help them lead effectively in the workplace. So thank you, Nina. Thank you, Tendai, for sharing your thoughts. Thank you to those of you who dialed in and attended. I hope that you found something valuable through that listening in conversation, and we look forward to hearing from you and engaging with you in the future. So thanks, everyone.